Hello, I am Omar Yassin and I will be discussing and explaining the possible consequences of failing to involve the end user in the design process. And since we're speaking of the design process, I thought I'd create this horrible looking PowerPoint slide as an example of bad design. And I'll explain why it's bad and factors that can improve it and factors that go into the design process later on. An example of a better design PowerPoint slide would be the following, and I'll explain why later. And failing to involve the end user in the design process might lead to something as, like we can see in the background there, user frustration. So I'll start off by taking you through some bad design examples and good design examples and the difference between them. Here we see for inputs like email and password. In the bad example, there is no title. The user doesn't know what they're meant to input. This will take longer. This will make the user take longer on that page, on the UI. We usually want to make the interaction between the user and the software very seamless and make it as fast as possible. So this will take longer. They will have to think more, which might cause user frustration. Another issue with this design on the left is that when there is an error, it only says error occurred. It does not inform the user what the error is or what they can do about it, whereas on the right it tells them that it's an incorrect password and they can reset it via that link. There are other great and bad examples on this specific example, like the icons and other things. However, I will move on to the next example. Buttons that are important on the software and are used a lot in the UI are called call to action buttons. For example, sign up, sign in, confirm, cancel, like the ones in front of you. You want to differentiate between them to make the, again, interaction between the user and the software very seamless. You don't want the user to accidentally click on cancel, for example, after writing a whole form, or you don't want them to click on confirm from something they didn't want to submit or confirm. Therefore, you might want to use color or maybe sometimes shape sizes to, like the size of the button, to differentiate between them and make them obvious for the user. Another example which I find quite funny is says please enter your phone number. However, it uses a slider for with I assume all the possible phone numbers in the world, which again takes the user a very long time. It's very inconvenient and horrible design. So when we come to think about the design process, UX comes to mind, or user experience, same thing. And this relates to how the user will interact with the software or with the program, what goes on in the user's mind and how they will physically interact with the program. And so we can look at stuff like thumb zone, for example, and the areas for like better reachability by the user, their thumbs. In examples like this, you want to put most features of the software in the natural zone. This to make it like the stuff that the user will do a lot of times. You want to put it in the natural zone because then they don't have to stretch hard, and which causes frustration to reach the ends. So you want them, for example, navigation. You want to put that in the natural zone. Anything that they will do continuously in the natural zone. However, sometimes it might be beneficial to put stuff like call to action buttons and important buttons in the stretching or hard areas. This is because you don't want the user to accidentally press on them in the natural zone. So let's talk about why the initial starting slide was a bad UI example. A factor that is very important in software and in the design process is readability. You don't want to cause the user eyesore. You want to adhere to language norms. So if it's English, you want to make the app from left to right, up to bottom. So if we go all the way back here, you can see that usually you want the user to read the title first. So you wouldn't put it below the name by Omar Yassin. And if we go back, text consistency is very important. You want to have the same color throughout the software, and it's usually black or white or similar shades as to not cause eye soreness again. And you want to have similar font so the user isn't confused or frustrated by having to read lots of different fonts. And the font size should also be consistent between similar text types. For example, the title or the head and the body of the text used. We also can look at interactions between the user and the software. This is another factor that comes into play. We can think of cognitive load. Cognitive load is how much the user has to figure out on their own while using the software. So you want to minimize that as much as possible. You want to make it usable by a 5-year-old, basically, and as simple as possible. There's also information overload. Sometimes this is with software where you have to share a lot of information with the user. You don't want to just throw text at them, and sometimes to overcome that you can visualize the text or data being used. Whereas if you have a screen full of text, it can be off-putting and cause user frustration. Maybe when you're designing a web page, you might want to space out the text and not put just information text overload on that. Or else people will decide to go to other web pages where there are images, for example, or other types of visual references other than just text overload. Navigation also comes to mind. Is the navigation convenient? Is it does it conform to the UI norms or the design norms? For example, having a menu, an exit button, a close button in the top corners of the window, the usual stuff. Is it memorable, basically, for the user? Is a user, if he's going to use, or if the user is going to use other apps, can they take that user experience into your software or program and apply it there? Animations also come to mind. While they may look, elegant and pretty, basically, in your software and make it look nice, sometimes you might want to not use certain animations because they take longer, for example, to get the data across or output the information to your user, which can cause frustration, like waiting like 3 seconds for an image or something to fade in instead of just being there. That can cause frustration for the user. So you might want to not use animations at times. So let's look at the consequences of not adhering to all these factors and not involving the end user. Because the end user knows what they want from the software more than anyone else. More than the designer, the programmer, anyone, because the end user will be the one using the software in the end, utilizing it. So when you don't involve the end user, the software may be designed inappropriately, which will obviously cause user frustration, and therefore the software will not be used, which is a waste of the development cost.